Today's video is looking at the character of Brabantio in Othello and asking basically what's the point of him, and thinking particularly about how Shakespeare uses the character. So we're not necessarily focused on what the character does, but his functions within the play and the way that he is used to illuminate and draw out other characters. So this is going to be quite a short video, just giving you some pointers as to where to go and how to frame your debate. So, obviously, Brabantio is a major player in Act 1 and then disappears off stage. So in Act 1, Scene 1, firstly, we see him as a symbol of authority in Venice. He is a senator, he is important, he is significant, and therefore, to a certain extent, he represents Venetian society. So the attitudes and values he says, we have to presume in some way are representative of the values of Venice, and we're not saying his views are universally accepted, they're very much not, but they are part of the fabric of Venetian society because he is an important figure who has views that are unsavoury, that he is allowed to promulgate because he is a senator. He's also a somewhat absurd figure. I particularly like the version that we've got on the T-Drive of the Globe, where you've got him running around flapping in his nightie having a fit, and he's so ridiculous. He's kind of comedic, and these early scenes in Othello, particularly the scenes connected to Iago, are often very funny. We like funny things, and when we see Iago being the puppet master on stage, getting Rodrigo all wound up and then getting Brabantio all wound up, it helps us to like Iago because Iago is providing us with the things that are making us laugh. Okay, so however indirectly, Brabantio and Iago don't ever talk to each other properly. But however indirectly, Brabantio is being used by Shakespeare to help us to like Iago and to enjoy his villainy when it is this sort of low-level playing pranks sort of villainy. We also see that Brabantio is immediately against Othello and Desdemona. Okay, we see that he takes the suggestion that the Moor has married his daughter. He is horrified. And I think that this goes beyond simple racism, and I think it's important to recognise that. So there is a racist issue in there. We see that he has a problem with it. But there's also the fact that he has not given his permission. He clearly is a man who is used to ruling the roost, and his daughter has run off and done something without his permission that he does not approve of. So there's a gendered issue and a sort of patriarchal society issue. And I think to a certain extent there's also a class issue. He doesn't like Rodrigo when Rodrigo shows up in Act 1, Scene 1. But by the end of the scene, he's going, God, I wish you'd had her instead of the Moor. So that's a paraphrase, that's not an accurate quotation. So we see to a certain extent as well, there's this issue that Othello is a professional man. He's not high in society by virtue of his birth or his background. He's there because he's earned his place. And for someone like Brabantio, this sort of emerging meritocracy would be very much a challenge to his position in society. So I think it's more than just simple racism, but it is important that there's this immediately a roadblock set up. And this obstacle on the way to their true happiness, which they have to overcome, which is actually more of a comedic figure than a tragic figure normally. So in things like A Midsummer Night's Dream, to an extent Much Ado About Nothing, we have these characters where the fathers are meddling in the affairs of their daughters, and their daughters are making their own choices and falling in love with who they want to fall in love with, and the fathers are meddling or being difficult or disruptive. And Brabantio very much falls into that sort of character. But obviously in this play it has much more serious overtones, and I think it's one of the things that helps to differentiate this from your more sort of classic Aristotelian tragedies, where Shakespeare is using these very familiar family connections right at the start in a tragic way. Okay, so there's quite a bit of subversion of expectations and rewriting the rule book to an extent on tragedy. So this isn't Shakespeare rejecting tragedy and tragic conventions, he is adding new ones. Okay, and I think the way that he uses Brabantio in this does show that, because you know your other tragic figures, you've got Capulet, but Capulet never really knows what's going on. He's meddling, but he's in a different league altogether. You've got King Lear, who doesn't really get involved in these sorts of things. So this angry father who doesn't like his daughter's choice of husband is a relatively rarer and newer addition to the tragic sort of oeuvre. And one of the things I always ask is, are we supposed to take him seriously? I don't think so. I don't think we're ever supposed to see that he could be a true obstacle. He is a hurdle that our couple have to overcome in order to live happily ever after. The problem is this is the start of the play, so there's a lot of play for to happen after that obstacle is overcome. But I think he's supposed to be seen as someone who's unreasonable and irrational and flies off the handle and is somewhat silly and ridiculous, because that then produces a really nice contrast with Othello, who is our heroic figure for this play. So as we move into Act 1, Scene 2, we see Brabantio as, again, that sort of puppet of Iago. So Iago has himself, and using Rodrigo, manipulated Brabantio into charging on stage in the middle of the night, interrupting Othello and Desdemona's wedding night, and threatening to fight Othello, who is clearly younger than him, clearly fitter than him, is a professional soldier. He looks ridiculous. And we see him being made a fool of, and we enjoy it. So we get very quickly established that Iago can manipulate people into doing things that would seem rather out of character. He can manipulate them into doing things for our entertainment, and there isn't a real point to it, remember, either. So that sort of motiveless malignity, I think, is arguably quite present here, because Iago's doing this just because he fancies ruining Othello's wedding night. There's not really a bigger agenda at play at this point. And even if they don't come to blows, even if Othello kind of wins the day, he still had quite a lot of disruption and had to deal with a very angry father-in-law. Brabantio could also be representing institutional racism here. He is a senator of Venice. He very clearly has a problem. He brings up all this idea of magic and witchcraft, as if he can't possibly believe that his daughter would fall in love with Othello through any other means. And if a senator of Venice is saying that, then that is saying that to some extent Venetian society itself has that unpleasantness in it to a certain extent. But then also there's that institutional classism. He clearly feels Othello isn't good enough for his daughter, whether or not he is white. It's also that he's not of the right sort of social standing. So there is an institutional classism here, and again, that sort of hierarchy in society. All of these are things that Iago, who, remember, is watching this scene, he is on stage during this while Brabantio is throwing all this stuff at him. All of these things Iago will use as little levers later on in Act 3 into Othello's jealousy. One of the big functions of Brabantio in Act 1, Scene 2 is that it allows the audience to see Othello's character. So having Brabantio on stage allows Shakespeare to show us that Othello is more measured, he is in control, he's much calmer than the apparently superior Brabantio, both by race and class. We see Othello is actually the superior man. So it's a very effective way of establishing quite quickly the sort of expectations for Othello, and how even when utterly provoked, he is the one who's telling people, I'm not fighting, this is absurd, we will sort it out. He's very calm, and he doesn't say much in this scene compared to Brabantio's ranting and raving, but that actually works very effectively to show him being in control. So sometimes a character is used to reveal things about another character, and I think we see that with Brabantio in this scene. And we also, however, see that this allows Othello to establish his authority, because when Brabantio threatens to fight him, he's saying, I don't need anyone to tell me when it's time to fight, which has got a bit of a threat in there. And Othello doesn't like being challenged. He has to defer to Brabantio to a certain extent because he is his social superior, being a senator, and he's also now his father-in-law. But most productions will show you that Othello isn't very happy about this. And remember, we then find out in Act 1, Scene 3 that apparently Brabantio was Othello's friend to a certain extent. He often invited him to his house and to tell his stories. So Othello may have been hoping for a much better reaction than the one he gets. So there is that sort of frustration and that very obvious resistance to what Othello and Desdemona have done, which again is something that Iago is able to use later on. And then in Brabantio's final scene, again thinking about what he does, he allows Desdemona to prove her love for Othello. So we get that beautiful bit where Desdemona comes in and he says, where do you owe the most duty? And think about that. And Desdemona goes, well, obviously I've always been a dutiful daughter, but now I must be a dutiful wife, which takes precedence. So we get Desdemona being established as this brave, bold woman who can stand up for what she believes in, which obviously is therefore diminished as the play goes on in such a sad way. So again, Brabantio's character is used to help give us some information about Desdemona. It's also key that he is shown to be an outlier in the Duke's court. So his attitude about the witchcraft and all of that normally gets unsupported on the stage. So he's shown to be someone who is saying these things, but the others aren't necessarily going along with it. But he is still a senator of Venice, still important. So we get that sense that Shakespeare's establishing that Venetian society itself isn't necessarily against Desdemona and Othello, but sections of it would be. Okay, the Duke is shown to be very reasonable and measured and level-headed and quite accepting of all of this. You get that classic line, well, I think this would have won my daughter too, after Othello's big speech where he explains how he wooed Desdemona. And I think that it's really important to note that Brabantio loses, but he doesn't lose anything really. He doesn't lose his position or his standing. He's made to look a bit foolish and to make the best of it. But we also have to question, would this have been brushed under the carpet so easily if Othello wasn't of more use to the Duke at that moment in time than Brabantio was? They've got a war coming with the Turkish fleet, they think. So we have to have Othello and we have to keep him on side. We can't lock him up because he's run off with one of our daughters. There are bigger things at stake. So the contrast between the sort of scale and the setting and the influence of the military conflict is really effectively woven in to make us question just how supportive society would have been if it wasn't this particular day in these particular circumstances. And as I say, Brabantio's character also emphasises Othello's value to Venice. Look at the different ways they greet it. The Duke is delighted to see Othello and then goes, oh, sorry, didn't see you there, to Brabantio. So that sense of Othello has a role and a purpose that perhaps Brabantio, to a certain extent, right now doesn't have. And therefore the expedient route is to allow this marriage. We also get emphasised here the illicit nature of Othello and Desdemona's relationship. It was conducted behind closed doors. She gave her father to believe that she didn't care about him whilst actually falling madly in love with him, which again is something that Iago seizes on and is really the crux of his argument in convincing Othello of Desdemona's deceit, which we'll look at in a minute. But it really emphasises the fact that this has been done in secret, hidden away. Othello as much as Desdemona. Othello never seems to worry that he deceived everyone as well, because that's allowed. But Desdemona's deceit is effectively used to condemn her later on. And I would argue that Brabantio arguably provides Iago with the inspiration for the rest of the play. So at this point, as I've said, Iago doesn't have much of a plan. He's just causing trouble. After this, his plan starts to solidify, and it solidifies around Desdemona. And that, to me, is because of this couplet from Brabantio, which is his final lines in the play, which I think arguably are the most important lines in the play. So, look to her more if thou hast eyes to see. She has deceived her father and may thee. And there's so much you can say about this couplet. So, firstly, we're really getting established the societal belief in the untrustworthiness of women. She's lied to one man at one point in her life, therefore she is untrustworthy for the rest of her life. You can't trust her, you can't behave. If she would lie to her father, she'll lie to her husband. So, we've got that immediate establishing of this sense that in this society Women are inherently untrustworthy, dangerous creatures who will deceive you given the chance. Key, Iago is on stage to hear this, and he uses it later on, because it's echoed by him in Act 3, Scene 3, with these this little section here, where Iago's talking about, I know our country disposition well, and remember, he likes to other Othello and make it seem like he just is a bit clueless about what's going on. And he talks about how women will deceive you and trick you. And we get that she did deceive her father marrying you, and when she seemed to shake and fear your looks, she loved them most. She that so young could give out such a seeming to seal her father's eyes up close as oak, he thought was witchcraft. So all of Brabantio's absurd ranting and raving and anger and frustration and silliness in Act 1, which we were laughing at, now comes back in Act 3 as a weapon that Iago uses, because he's seen all of this. It's always important to know when he's on stage that he clobbers Othello over the head with and goes, yeah, but you can't trust her because she made her father believe that she was totally disinterested, possibly even scared of you, and that was when she was most in love with you. So she could convince her father, who has known her all her life, of that. How can you possibly know, just from her looks and her behaviour, how she feels about you? And remember, we've had it emphasised that this is a very rapid relationship. It's been illicit, it's been behind closed doors, and all of that Iago brings out in those lines, and Othello doesn't have an answer to it. Because in this society where everyone knows that women are untrustworthy, how can he possibly argue with this? So this couplet from Brabantio here is the sort of killer blow that Iago uses to undo our tragic hero and send him spiralling off in this jealousy, that sends him sort of insane by the end. We also get this sense of Othello being blinded to Desdemona's deception and being made a fool of, which is obviously one of the things he's really scared of, that idea of cuckoldry. So when he's being told, look to her if you've got eyes to see it, saying, if you can see her clearly. So that imagery is about eyes and seeing clearly is something that is really important, because one of Othello's big things is not necessarily just that she is cheating on him, but that he's being made a fool of and being shown to be almost like laughed at, which is obviously something that Iago is very concerned about as well. And the theme of reputation runs through this play very heavily. So when Iago says that, when Brabantio uses this imagery, and then Iago brings it up as well and says, well, look, can you not see how she did that there? It all works to not only make him convinced of her deception, but also that he looks like an idiot for not having seen it sooner. And then I think one of the saddest things in this is that Desdemona is condemned by her independent choice. There is an inevitability to her outcome, because in this society, in this world, the very fact that she made a choice of Othello is the thing that kills her, because her disobedience to her father and her determination to be with Othello is seen as the very thing that proves that she is untrustworthy and must be cheating on Othello. And so the logical paradox of that, and she can't defend against it, sends her into this inevitable outcome, with the seeds of which are sown in Act 1, Scene 3. So from these lines here from Brabantio, all of the rest of it sort of springs out, all of Iago's plan springs out, which allows him to perpetrate the terrible things that he does later on. So remember, we're talking about Brabantio. He's only on stage during Act 1, so he's got short, sharp impact, but he does a lot during this time. He's dead by the end, we get told, apparently of grief for Desdemona's choice. And really interestingly, he's aligned with the villains, so we shouldn't like him. I've said before, when a villain says it, we're not supposed to endorse it. But he's also proved right. Othello is the undoing of Desdemona. Her choice does condemn her. So Shakespeare seems to be trying to have his cake and eat it, because he sort of celebrates the fact that she's made this choice and that she's this independent woman. But then at the same time, her father's sort of curse comes to pass, whereby his conviction that Othello shouldn't have married Desdemona actually is proven right. So there is quite an interesting argument here for the restoration of order and for the status quo, even though through the vast majority of the play it seems like Othello and Desdemona, they're entitled to be together. But we also get that Brabantio, who we've dismissed as an absurd, ridiculous figure, actually is proven right. And I will leave it to you to unpick exactly why you think Shakespeare does that and what we're supposed to take away from it.